Gainax was a really strange company in their infancy. They did create very important works like Evangelion and today's topic, Gunbuster. But you know, nothing's ever that simple. And yes, I am aware of the more recent scandals brought on by Gainax, and while we will be touching on those very briefly in the video today, it's not going to be the main focus, at least in this video. And like I stated in my previous Evangelion related videos, wherever you stand on liking or disliking that franchise, you at least gotta admit the show has had its influence on anime and entertainment as a whole. However, Gainax is known for some really wacky stuff. One phrase that will continuously pop up when you dig into their work is Gainaxing it. Now, let's be clear here. I'm not saying fan service didn't exist in anime or entertainment prior, but it's kind of hilarious when you realize the same company that's early era is propped up for creating classic animes would also be synonymous with inspiring a whole host of pervy stuff as well. You can't put a label on success. The point I'm trying to make here is Gainax really was a company that legit had no shame, at least in the early days, and they had a bit of a rebellious streak. This helped propel their products in association with their animation, and many of those animations have become timeless classics today. It's definitely something to be admired. However, if you thought the Gainax bump was as deep as the early 90s rabbit hole of Gainax went, then oh boy. Here's where things get pretty wacky though, because if you've seen my mysterious Evangelion hentai video, or looked at the title of the video, you'll know one of the things that Gainax loves to do more than anything was create adult-based material off of their products. More often than not, these would come out to capitalize on the success of their popular animes. And it's kind of crazy because a lot of this stuff isn't that hard to find either, both in an informational sense as well as consumption on the internet, and surprisingly, it's never really talked about that much, at the very least here on YouTube. You'd think more and more news outlets would have picked up on this stuff and had a field day with it. Consider this, recently Anno himself had to come out and say him and his work are no longer and have not been associated with Gainax for a long time. Came in part after the president of the Gainax company was arrested in 2019. Anno needed to make this statement because news outlets kept making articles about the studio president who was arrested, but linked it directly to Evangelion for that sweet, sweet clickbait. The point being, if they could create buzz, they'd post it. The other being that fans can be quite tribalistic at times, and news outlets have smartened up over the years. They love stirring up drama. Get the fans in a frenzy over any info, and rake in the cash.
Ah, the sweet smell of an all-day sucker.
I don't know, maybe it's already well known by the mainstream media and it's already been milk dry and I'm just treading on old ground here. However, during the early days, Gainax struggled to keep the doors open, so to speak, and would end up making other types of content in order to keep the studio afloat. For example, oftentimes Anno himself would take on other jobs outside of Gainax and work on various projects not directly involved with his main projects in order to sustain himself. And would you believe Anno was actually the co-director on a video game? Of course you would. You clicked on the video. During his long and prestigious career, Anno has been a part of the production for a few video games. Generally speaking, it was normally as like a special thanks or like a generalized supervision role, but I'll get into more of that later. However, his video game debut and only co-directing credit for design was on a game known as Cybernetic Highschool Part 3 Gunbuster. The game itself was also based off of his directorial debut in anime for the series of the same name, entitled Aim for the Top, or Gunbuster. It's also produced and sanctioned by Gainax. And it's straight up porn.
Relax your body now!
So for all the new people here who subbed after watching Day of the Warrior, thank you. I genuinely appreciate you guys coming back to check this video out. And also, I'm sorry.
No, you're not. Yes, I am. No, you're not. Yes, I am.
This is Anno's Forgotten Adult Game and the legacy of Gainax's adult products. Well, I got that all in one try. Gunbuster was originally an OVA series that released in Japan between October 7th, 1988 and July 7th, 1989. And previously stated was Anno's directorial debut. A common misconception is that Anno was actually the creator of Gunbuster, when in fact the honor actually goes to Toshio Okada, who was one of the 7 original founders of Gainax, whereas Anno was basically just there as the director on the project. I say basically directing it like it isn't that big of a deal, when in reality it was a huge amount of work. Gunbuster follows a girl by the name of Noriko, who becomes a mecha pilot to combat aliens after her father was killed when she was only 7. I'll be honest, one of the reasons I hadn't covered this topic until now is because I hadn't actually watched Gunbuster yet. Which isn't necessarily a prerequisite to me creating a lot of these videos, but I would rather have some sort of frame of reference before I approach a topic. The show itself is fantastic. Just from an artistic point, there are so many spots in the show where you can just pause the OVAs and gush at the artwork. And the story itself, without getting into too many spoilers, is great as well. Now, it isn't going to be as mind-bending as a lot of other Gainax properties. It's still Gainax, though. But I'll say, like, the final 2 minutes of the anime, in my opinion, without spoiling it at all, is, for lack of a better word, just beautiful. The OVA is only 6 episodes long, and each episode clocks in at about 30 minutes, give or take, probably a little bit less than that. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you take some time out of your schedule to watch this, because it's fantastic. In my opinion, you can absolutely see how it helped inspire not only Evangelion and other Gainax properties, but other anime in the 90s and 2000s in general. So I think you can kind of understand why it comes as a bit of a shock that this heartfelt anime series would have an adult sanctioned video game based off of it. Now, Gunbuster did have nudity in it. Let's not pretend like it didn't, but it kinda made sense within the context of the OVAs. Emphasize the phrase kind of, like Gainax kind of. If I'm completely honest, you can definitely see the pervy side of Gainax starting to come out during OVA 2 of Gunbuster. I guess if you really thought about it, Gainax just skipping the middleman and creating straight porn wouldn't be that out of the realm of impossibility. Alright, before we go any further, let's address the elephant in the room here. Again, without spoiling too much here, Gunbuster isn't exactly just a giant mecha anime. Sure, there's giant robots and giant aliens and they beat the crap out of each other, but the root of the story is all about sacrifice, and more specifically the sacrifice of one's time. To get to the point, the main character Noriko is 15 at the start of the series, and although time manipulation is involved in the story, the game definitely isn't centered around that. And even if we were to assume the story is canonical, and minor spoilers here, Noriko, at least at the furthest extent of the stories, is 17 and maybe 18 by the story's conclusion. You can definitely see why that would cause problems for this game. That might also be the reason why other games in the series were getting banned, but I'll touch on that a bit later. So does everyone feel awkward yet? Okay, good. Now, segueing away from that, originally, Gainax was created under the banner Diacon Film, before switching its name to Gainax. And while the creation of Gainax itself is interesting, I want to focus more on the time frame between 1988 and 1990, because despite Gunbuster being a commercial success in Japan, Gainax would still find it hard to stay afloat financially. And that's where this little anomaly comes into play, because on March 24th, 1990, Cybernetic Highschool Part 3 Gunbuster was released. It released on both the PC-88 and PC-98 systems, with an MSX release following later in the year on November 20th, 1990. I'm actually oversimplifying the hell out of why it was hard for Gainax to stay financially afloat, because it's quite a bit more complicated than that. According to Anime News Network, around this time, Japan was hit with a huge financial crisis that lasted until 2001, which was brought on by the massive amounts of financial deregulation in the 80s. This eventually all caught up to the Japanese economy. Because of this, Gainax looked for other avenues of creating profit, hence why they ended up creating a lot of their pornographic material. Anime News Network also stated that prior to Gunbuster's success, Anno himself had been working on other properties outside of Gainax to keep himself afloat. Again, an oversimplification of a complex situation. My take on this is, prior to the Japanese financial crisis, Gainax basically did anything they could to keep their dream alive. Side jobs, pornographic material, etc, etc, etc. Then post-collapse, they just kind of thought, we had a hit and we're still broke. Guess it's time to start selling porn again.
We cannot afford to be picky!
One thing to note is, at the top of the Anime News Network article, it states that some of the details in the documentary were under dispute. This mostly had to do with Laserdisc copies of Diacon 4 as well as the anime Karikano, and overall the article is decent to read. And as far as I can tell, the adult-oriented material, which admittedly was very little in the article, still checks out. Regardless, I have it linked below and you should definitely read through it. Let's take a look at the game in question now. And thanks to Moby Games, we actually don't have to download or buy anything. However, like with my previous video, if you are looking for it, it is out there and relatively easy to find. So, Cybernetic Highschool Gunbuster Edition is the third game in the long-running series. Giant Bomb has 3 of these listed, whereas Toshio Okado's Wikipedia page has 4 of these listed, so I don't know, there might be a lost one of these like roaming around out there. In the game, you play as an alpha top class who's supposed to get the keys to the Gunbuster from the 3 heroines of the show, and you do this by answering questions. Yeah, it's one of those answer questions, see boobs, quiz show type of games, except for it was created by Gainax and not created on Newgrounds. Each character's questions would also have a theme. Noriko would be science fiction and animation, Kazumi would be fashion for some reason, and Jungfreud would be military tech and Soviet Russia. Because Russia, I guess. The screenshots you can find online aren't all translated, but Moby Games has a couple of them that are. And the questions themselves seem pretty standard and nothing really outlandish. But the backgrounds in this thing are something completely different. Let's take, for example, our resident Russian here, who is so red that she strips in front of Lenin. Yup, that's a real image. Giving Hong Kong 97 a run for its money here, but let's be frank, Gainax knew what they were making and just kind of said, screw it. They cared so little about what other people thought of this game that they just decided to throw Freud in an image that says Tetris on it. Because Russia. And if I'm being completely honest, the others don't really have a funny background gimmick or anything like that. But I will say, aesthetically, I do enjoy the look of some of the menus and the art of the ship presented here. I've always been a sucker for the look of PC 98, 99, and MSX games, so I guess I'm a bit biased there. Also, an interesting note is that the packaging and cover of the game was created by artist Haruhiko Mikimoto, which has created some freaking amazing artwork over the years. And if you take nothing else from this video, at least now you know who Mikimoto is, and hopefully it'll inspire you to go look them up because their artwork is nothing less than amazing. Admittedly, the background and context surrounding the game's creation is the more fascinating bit on this topic, as there's not a whole lot to the game.
Not a whole lot.
Answer a question, clothes come off. Answer another question, more clothes come off. If you got this in 1990, you weren't buying it for the pulse-pounding gameplay. You were playing for the nudes. And it's funny that I should mention that because the game itself also thought of the customer's privacy as well. I'm not even joking. You could actually press one of the keys in the game and a racing game would pop up over the pornography, completely covering for the perv who bought the game. Innovation. Alright, so when we look at the credits of the game, there we see Anno as the director of the game. So I know what some of you are probably thinking. It's gotta be just a coincidence. Maybe there's somebody else with the exact same name, or they're just giving him credit for directing Gunbuster originally. Well, 2 things. According to the Moby Games article, we'll see it lists the entire crew who worked on it. Here you'll notice the names of Toshio Okada and Takami Akai as well. Well, as we discussed earlier, Okada is the creator and one of the writers on Gunbuster, at least according to Wikipedia, and both men were founding members of Gainax, so it doesn't get any closer than that. And when you look at their roles, they acted as producers and directors on the project. So, I mean, I guess you could take this as my opinion, but I definitely don't feel like it was handed off on another group to make the game. Like I mentioned earlier, because of the financial crisis, Gainax was struggling to stay afloat, so they're making these porn games as a way to essentially keep the doors open. And if you know anything about creating a startup, once you get going, it's all hands on deck to just basically survive. Also, clicking on Anno's name in Moby Games lists out everything he has been a part of, video game creation-wise. At the bottom, he is given a special thanks for the FMV games based off of the series. That's because he was given credit for helping to create the Gunbuster series. He didn't actually work on the FMV games, at least as far as I'm aware. In fairness, Anno has never publicly stated that he worked on the game. Can't make this easy, I guess. But honestly, I can kind of see why he wouldn't want to actively bring up his hand in creating adult video games. So here I am dredging up dirty laundry, but the information is still out there. The pornography-based games were created at a time when the company itself was struggling. I should note there are no exact figures as to how much their adult products were making at the time. But it obviously helped keep the lights on, so I imagine it was pretty significant. And I mean that because even after Evangelion came out, it didn't stop them from creating adult-themed Evangelion merch when the show became a hit. And again, I don't have figures, but I would bet they made bank off of all that merchandise. But I digress. Slight tangent, but a thing to note is that according to the Anime News Network article, the first game in the Cybernetic Highschool series would be banned in a Japanese prefecture. The Wikipedia article also states this as well, stating the game was banned on July of 1992. And despite this citation on both the Wikipedia page as well as the Anime News Network article, I can't find the original article that states this, or like the Japanese lawsuit or whatever the case was that made this happen. It's supposedly in a news article from Japan Economic Newswire, January 24th, 1990, Monday edition. So if anyone has access to this article or can tell me how I can find it, definitely let me know so I can read it over myself. It's also worth mentioning that later, after Evangelion's success, Gainax themselves would be hit by the tax agency for potential tax evasion based on profits from Evangelion-related properties. And that is true, and if I can go off topic here for just a quick second. Right around the time the tax audit happened, that's when we started seeing the mysterious Evangelion hentai pop up in different circles, like doujinshi circles in Japan. So it is kind of funny that right around the time the audit happened, that's when that thing would start circulating. I know it's a bit off topic. I just don't know if we're ever going to really have a reason to talk about the Evangelion hentai again, in pure speculation on my part, but I could actually see Gainax creating the Evangelion hentai, but deciding to squash releasing it because they got hit with the tax audit. My logic behind this is that Gainax was getting hit with a tax audit based off the merchandise sales of Evangelion, so CDs, games, toys, etc., etc., etc. And as we've seen today, Gainax has a history of creating adult-themed entertainment, which was one of the main sources of income that kept them afloat in their infancy. But if you're already getting hit for tax evasion based off of related properties, the last thing you want to do is create another one. The movie's also banned in a lot of places for obvious reasons, but after looking at everything today, I could definitely see this being more of an in-house job, but that's all speculation on my part. There's also an article on Medium via user Evan Kaiser, where Anno was interviewed in 2019 about Gainax tainting the Evangelion name, or rather he was making a statement because a lot of companies were basically using him and the Evangelion's name as clickbait. In the post, Anno discussed a lot of Gainax and Ava's history, and mentions that at the time when Evangelion was successful, the company was making a lot of money. The direct quote from Anno says, "Meanwhile, it looked like Gainax was profiting a lot, and Evangelion CDs and games. I say quote-unquote looked like because, as I mentioned before, I wasn't involved in management, so I didn't know anything about that part." Now, admittedly, the quote is cherry-picked from the article, but I do have it linked below because it is a very fascinating read, and I think you guys should take a look at it because it talks a lot more about Anno's past in Gainax as well as his thoughts and feelings in Evangelion. Definitely take the time to read through the article. And unfortunately, Gainax's involvement in adult-oriented entertainment isn't mentioned in the article at all. Rather, Anno talks about Gainax barely being able to keep the doors open until Ava was a hit. However, according to some of the info that we've covered here today, you can infer a lot from those statements, but I always think that it's better to hear it directly from the person themselves. I might dive deeper into the tax audit stories sometime in the future, but until then, that was Anno's Forgotten Adult Game and the legacy of Gainax's adult product catalog. To me, this is just another piece of the insane history of Gainax, and it's a history that I'm definitely going to come back to in the future. Let me know in the comments below if I left anything out or just messed something up entirely. Lord knows I'm guilty of that. Make sure to keep things light and rebellious, and I'll see you guys next time.